The night the lights went out and Elvis made magic. When the power went out during Elvis's concert, leaving 20,000 people in complete darkness, everyone thought the show was over. What happened next became the most intimate performance in rock and roll history, and changed how music would be performed forever. It was November 22, 1975, at Chicago's International Amphitheater. Elvis was in the middle of his biggest tour of the year, and tonight's show was completely sold out. 20,000 screaming fans had packed into the massive arena, expecting the full Elvis experience: blazing lights, thunderous sound, and that iconic white jumpsuit sparkling under the spotlights. But Mother Nature had other plans. A massive winter storm had been building all day across the Midwest. Wind gusts were reaching 70 miles per hour, and the power grid was struggling. But the show must go on, right? Elvis had just finished an explosive version of Burning Love, and was transitioning into Hound Dog when it happened. Crack! A lightning bolt struck the main power line feeding the amphitheater. In an instant, 20,000 people were plunged into complete darkness. The silence was deafening. Elvis's voice cut off mid-note. The band stopped playing. Even the emergency lights had failed. The only sound was the howling wind outside and 20,000 people holding their breath in the pitch-black arena. Most performers would have evacuated. Most venues would have cancelled the show immediately. But this was Elvis Presley, and he wasn't going anywhere. Can you imagine being in that arena when everything went silent? In the darkness, Elvis called out to his audience, "Well, folks, looks like we've got ourselves a little situation here." His voice echoed through the arena without amplification, reaching maybe the first few rows. The crowd began to murmur, unsure of what was happening. "Charlie," Elvis called to Charlie Hodge, his longtime friend and guitarist, "you got that acoustic guitar handy?" Charlie fumbled around in the darkness backstage and found his acoustic guitar. He made his way to Elvis by feel, guided by Elvis's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis announced, his natural voice projecting as far as it could, "I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is we've lost all our power. The good news is, well, we're about to find out." What happened next had never been attempted in the history of large venue concerts. Elvis sat down at the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side, and Charlie handed him the acoustic guitar. In the complete darkness, Elvis began playing the opening chords to Love Me Tender. His voice, without any amplification, filled the front section of the arena with a tenderness and intimacy that no microphone could have captured. It was raw, pure, and absolutely magical. But here's where the story gets incredible. As Elvis sang, something spontaneous began happening throughout the arena. People in the front rows, who could hear him clearly, began singing along. Then the people behind them joined in. Row by row, section by section, 20,000 people began singing Love Me Tender together in the darkness. The sound was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. It wasn't the usual screaming and cheering. It was 20,000 voices united in harmony, creating a natural amphitheater of human voices that filled every corner of that massive arena. Elvis stopped playing and just listened. He later said it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. "You know what, folks?" Elvis called out into the darkness. "I think we might be onto something here. And if you think that's incredible, wait until you hear what Elvis did next." For the next 2 hours, Elvis conducted what would become the most legendary unplugged concert in rock and roll history, except the term unplugged wouldn't be invented for another 15 years. He performed song after song on that acoustic guitar, with 20,000 people serving as his choir. When he sang Can't Help Falling in Love, grown men in the back rows were crying. When he performed Heartbreak Hotel, the entire arena became one massive voice singing along. But Elvis wasn't content to just sing. He started talking to his audience like they were sitting in his living room. "You know," Elvis said between songs, "I've been performing for 20 years, and I've never felt closer to an audience than I do right now. Sometimes the best things happen when everything goes wrong. He told stories about his childhood, about his mother Gladys, about how he learned to play guitar. Things he'd never shared publicly before. In the darkness, with no cameras rolling and no official recording happening, Elvis opened up in ways he never had before. "Music isn't about the lights or the amplifiers," Elvis said to the crowd. "It's about this, people coming together and sharing something real." About an hour into this impromptu acoustic set, something even more magical happened. A voice from somewhere in the middle of the arena called out, "Elvis, can you play Blue Suede Shoes?" Elvis laughed. "You know what? I haven't played that song acoustic in probably 10 years. But why not?" As he began the opening chords, something incredible occurred. The audience didn't just sing along, they began clapping the rhythm. 20,000 people in perfect synchronization, creating a percussion section that could be felt throughout the entire arena. The sound was so powerful that people outside the venue, walking through the parking lot in the storm, could hear it through the walls. What would you have done if you were in that audience that night? Word about what was happening inside began to spread. Local radio DJs who had come to cover the concert started broadcasting live reports about this unprecedented acoustic performance. Within an hour, radio stations across Chicago were telling people about the magical concert happening in complete darkness. But perhaps the most incredible moment came near the end of the evening. Elvis had just finished "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" when he said something that nobody in that arena would ever forget. "You know, folks, when I started singing 20 years ago, it was just me and a guitar. Tonight, you've reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Not because of the fame or the fancy costumes or the big stages. But because of this connection between people." He paused, and you could hear 20,000 people hanging on every word. "I want to thank you for giving me the best concert of my life. And I want you to remember something, the most beautiful music doesn't always come from the fanciest equipment. Sometimes it comes from the heart, in the dark, when we're all just people sharing a moment together." As Elvis played the final song of the evening, a haunting version of "I Can't Stop Loving You," maintenance crews were still working frantically to restore power. But nobody in that arena wanted the lights to come back on. This intimate, magical experience was something they knew they'd never have again. When the power finally returned at 11:47 p.m., the sudden blast of light and sound was almost jarring. Elvis stood up, guitar in hand, and looked out at the 20,000 faces he'd been singing to in the darkness. "Well," he said into the now working microphone, "I guess the spell is broken." But the spell wasn't broken. It had changed everything. The concert that was supposed to be a disaster became the most talked about performance of Elvis's career. Word spread quickly throughout the music industry about what had happened that November night in Chicago. Several people in the audience had small recording devices with them, and bootleg recordings of that acoustic concert became some of the most sought-after Elvis recordings ever made. Music critics called it Elvis at his most authentic and a masterclass in the power of simplicity. More importantly, that night changed how Elvis approached his performances. He started incorporating more acoustic segments into his regular concerts, creating moments of intimacy even in the largest venues. That night in Chicago reminded Elvis that his greatest instrument wasn't his voice, said Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager. It was his ability to connect with people on a human level. The concert also had a broader impact on the music industry. When MTV launched MTV Unplugged in 1989, the show's creators specifically cited Elvis's November 1975 acoustic performance as their inspiration. The idea that a major artist could strip away all the production and just connect with music and audience on the most basic level, said MTV executive Bruce Leddy, that all started with what Elvis did that night when the lights went out. For the 20,000 people who were there, the concert became a life-changing experience. Many said it was the most meaningful musical experience they'd ever had. "I've been to hundreds of concerts since then," said attendee Margaret Foster, "but nothing has ever come close to that night. It wasn't just a performance. It was like being part of something sacred. The storm that knocked out the power was just a weather event. But what Elvis did in response became a lesson about turning obstacles into opportunities, about finding beauty in unexpected moments, and about the power of human connection. That night proved that the most powerful performances don't always require the biggest production. Sometimes they just require an artist brave enough to be vulnerable, an audience willing to participate, and the magic that happens when people come together in the darkness and create light through music. Elvis could have walked off that stage when the power went out. He could have waited for the technical problems to be solved. Instead, he chose to create something that had never existed before, and something that could never be replicated. The night the lights went out in Chicago became the night Elvis found a new kind of magic. And everyone who was there became part of rock and roll history. This wasn't just a concert that survived a power outage. It was the night that proved music doesn't need electricity to be electrifying. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that sometimes our greatest moments come from our most unexpected challenges. Comment below, what would you have done if you were Elvis that night? And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories about the moments that changed music forever. If Elvis could create magic in complete darkness, what magic could you create when everything seems to go wrong?